History is often a masterwork painted by the victors, while the defeated are merely cast as the shadows in the background. The cold ink on these ancient pages fails to capture the terrifying heat of the fire that once consumed the heart of Rome. To understand the truth, one must look beyond the myth of the beast and gaze into the eyes of the man hidden beneath the tyrant's mask. I am locking the temporal coordinates to the year 54 AD to witness the very moment this dark era began. Let us leave the safety of the present and walk silently among the whispering ghosts of the Palatine Hill. Born beneath the salt spray of Antium, the boy who would eventually burn the world arrived into a lineage already stained with deep madness and absolute betrayal. He was never meant to be a ruler of men, but rather a gentle poet who found solace in the delicate strings of the lyre and the rhythm of verses. The shadow of his ancestors, particularly the divine Augustus, cast a long and suffocating darkness over his childhood that no amount of sunlight could ever truly pierce. His father left him with a legacy of cruelty, famously remarking that anything born of him and Agrippina could only result in a detestable curse for the state. Yet the young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was merely a pawn on a chessboard moved by invisible hands that cared nothing for his happiness or his sanity. The golden palaces of Rome were not homes for a child, but cold, echoing chambers filled with whispering spies and relatives who smiled while holding hidden daggers. He learned very quickly that in the high-stakes game of the Roman Empire, vulnerability was a fatal flaw that would be exploited by wolves in senators' robes. Destiny arrived not with a gentle knock, but with the thunderous realization that his adoption by Emperor Claudius was the first step toward his inevitable doom. The innocence of his youth was stripped away layer by layer, replaced by the heavy, cold armor of expectation that was far too large for his artistic soul. Thus began the tragedy of a boy who wanted to sing for the stars, but was forced to wield the sword that would eventually carve his name in blood. When the crown was finally placed upon his head, everyone in Rome knew that the true power did not rest with the teenage boy, but with his terrifying mother. Agrippina was a force of nature, a woman of iron will who had maneuvered through murder and marriage to ensure her son sat at the pinnacle of the world. She sat behind curtains during Senate meetings, her whispers echoing louder than the shouts of the most powerful men in the empire, dictating the fate of millions. Nero was flanked by his tutors, the stoic philosopher Seneca and the soldier Burrus, who fought a silent war against the mother for the soul of the young emperor. For the first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Nerinus, the empire flourished under this guidance, masking the rotting dysfunction that festered deep within the imperial family. But the young tiger began to grow resentful of the cage built by his mother, and the strings she pulled began to fray under the tension of his teenage rebellion. Agrippina's face appeared on coins beside his, a visual declaration that she was not merely the mother of the emperor, but a co-ruler equal in divine authority. Every time he tried to embrace a lover or make a decree, her shadow was there, a constant reminder that he owed his very breath and position to her machinations. The psychological pressure cooker was building toward an explosion, as the son realized that to truly be Caesar, he would have to destroy the one who made him Caesar. It was a deadly dance of power where love had long since withered, replaced by a cold, calculating struggle for survival between a mother and her own creation. The bond between mother and son finally snapped, leading Nero to conceive a plot so heinous that it would haunt his nightmares until his final breath left his body. He could no longer tolerate her threats to replace him with his stepbrother Britannicus, so he decided that the woman who gave him life must now lose hers. A collapsible boat was engineered, a mechanism of death disguised as a vessel of luxury, intended to drown the empress in the dark waters of the Mediterranean Sea. When the roof of the boat collapsed, Agrippina, driven by the instinct of a survivor, managed to swim to shore, unaware that her escape only delayed the inevitable horror. The news of her survival sent Nero into a panic, trembling in his palace, knowing that a wounded lioness is far more dangerous than one that is dead. Soldiers were dispatched to her villa to finish the job, marching with the heavy boots of executioners who knew they were about to commit a crime against nature. When they arrived, she bared her womb to their swords, commanding them to strike the very place that had brought such a monstrous son into the world. Her death marked the true beginning of Nero's reign, but it also marked the fracturing of his mind, as the guilt of matricide began to consume him. He claimed she had plotted against him, but the people of Rome whispered in the streets, knowing that the emperor had violated the most sacred law of humanity. From that night onward, the ghosts of the past would never leave him, and the emperor began to seek distractions in art and excess to silence the screaming in his head. With his mother gone, the only remaining restraint on Nero's impulses was his wife, the virtuous and noble Octavia, whom the people of Rome loved deeply. But Nero's heart had been captured by Poppaea Sabina, a woman of immense beauty and ambition who saw Octavia not as a rival, but as an obstacle to be removed. At Poppaea's urging, Nero divorced Octavia on false charges of barrenness, exiling her to a remote island where she would be cut off from all hope. The Roman mob, usually silent, rose in anger, tearing down the statues of Poppaea and covering Octavia's images with flowers, demanding the return of their beloved empress. Terrified by the public unrest, Nero briefly considered recalling her, but Poppaea's whispers of insecurity turned his fear into a cold, lethal resolve to end the problem permanently. False accusations of adultery were fabricated, and the innocent Octavia was condemned to death, her veins opened in a ritual that was more murder than execution. Her head was cut off and brought to Rome for Poppaea to gaze upon, a gruesome trophy that sealed the moral collapse of the imperial court forever. This act proved that justice in Rome was dead, replaced by the whims of a ruler who was enslaved by his passions and manipulated by those he loved. The Senate, fearful for their own lives, congratulated the emperor on his safety, turning a horrific tragedy into a celebration of sycophancy and cowardice. Octavia's death was the moment the people began to see Nero not as a troubled young man, but as a tyrant capable of devouring the innocent without remorse. As the years passed, the emperor's paranoia grew like a poisonous vine, strangling the last remnants of the logic and restraint that Seneca had tried to instill. The young Britannicus, his stepbrother and a potential rival for the throne, had been poisoned at a dinner party years prior, dying while Nero casually watched. Now, the circle of death expanded to include anyone who possessed wealth, influence, or a lineage that might threaten Nero's absolute grip on power. The definition of treason became fluid, expanding to include a lack of enthusiasm for the emperor's singing or a critical word spoken in the privacy of a home. Spies and informers roamed the streets of Rome, creating an atmosphere of terror where a son could betray his father for a pouch of gold coins. Wealthy senators were forced to commit suicide, their fortunes confiscated to fund the emperor's increasingly lavish lifestyle and his grand architectural dreams. The court became a theater of the absurd, where survival depended not on competence or loyalty, but on the ability to flatter the emperor's immense vanity. Even his old mentors were not safe. Burrus died under suspicious circumstances, and Seneca was pushed to the margins, watching his student become a monster. The mask of the benevolent ruler had fallen completely, revealing a man who saw the empire not as a responsibility, but as his personal playground. Rome was holding its breath, waiting for a spark to ignite the dry tinder of resentment that had accumulated during these years of blood and fear. Nero believed his true calling was not to rule armies or draft laws, but to perform upon the stage as a singer, an actor, and a charioteer. To the conservative Roman elite, an emperor performing in public was a scandal of epic proportions, a degradation of the dignity of his office. He forced the nobility to attend his performances, locking the doors of the theater so that no one could leave, regardless of how long the recital lasted. Stories circulated of women giving birth during his performances and men feigning death, just to be carried out of the theater to escape his singing. He traveled to Greece to compete in the Olympic Games, where judges terrified of his wrath awarded him every prize, even when he fell from his chariot. This obsession with Hellenistic culture was his attempt to transform Rome from a city of war into a city of art, but he lacked the wisdom to do it. He created the Neronia, a festival of games and arts, hoping to be loved not as a god-emperor, but as a talented artist among his people. Yet his art was fueled by narcissism, a desperate need for applause to fill the void where his conscience and his humanity used to reside. The army began to lose respect for a commander-in-chief who cared more about the tuning of his lyre than the discipline of the legions on the frontier. In his mind, he was Apollo reborn, but to the world, he was a deluded actor playing the role of king, unaware that the final curtain was approaching. On a sweltering July night in 64 AD, a fire broke out in the merchant shops near the Circus Maximus, ignited by the dry summer winds. The flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming the wooden tenements and narrow, twisting streets of Rome like a voracious beast that could not be sated. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the world burned, turning centuries of history, art, and temples into nothing more than piles of smoldering ash. Panic swept through the population as citizens fled their homes, trampled in the chaos, crying out for gods who seemed to have abandoned them to the inferno. Rumors began to swirl that the emperor himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his new palace, fueled by reports of men stopping others from extinguishing the flames. The enduring image of Nero playing his fiddle while Rome burned is likely a myth, but it captures the emotional truth of a ruler disconnected from his people's suffering. In reality, Nero was at Antium when the fire started and rushed back to organize relief efforts, opening his gardens to the homeless and lowering grain prices. Yet, as he looked out over the blackened ruin of his city, his mind was already calculating the artistic potential of the destruction rather than the human cost. The destruction was catastrophic. Of the 14 districts of Rome, only 4 remained intact, leaving the heart of the empire a smoking, hollow shell. This catastrophe would become the defining moment of his reign, the turning point where the dissatisfaction of the people turned into open hatred and suspicion. Desperate to deflect the rumors that he was the arsonist, Nero needed a scapegoat, a group of people already marginalized and misunderstood by the Roman public. He chose the Christians, a small religious sect that was viewed with suspicion for their secret rituals and their refusal to worship the emperor as a god. What followed was a persecution of nightmarish proportions, a spectacle of cruelty that shocked even the hardened populace of Rome who were used to violence. The historian Tacitus recounts how Christians were covered in the skins of wild beasts and torn apart by dogs, turning the arena into a slaughterhouse. Others were nailed to crosses in the imperial gardens, their suffering used as entertainment for the elite who strolled by with wine in their hands. In a display of absolute madness, Nero used living human beings as torches to light his garden parties at night, a horror that defied all reason. Nero walked among the crowds in his charioteer's costume, mingling with the spectators while the screams of the dying provided a macabre soundtrack. This extreme cruelty backfired, as the people began to feel pity for the victims, realizing that this was not justice, but the sadism of one man. The persecution of the Christians did not cleanse Nero's name. Instead, it stained his soul forever and marked him as the Antichrist in early Christian tradition. It was the act of a man who had lost all touch with morality, willing to burn flesh to save his own reputation, digging his grave deeper with every death. Upon the ashes of the neighborhoods destroyed by the fire, Nero began the construction of his dream palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was not just a palace, but a sprawling landscape of countryside in the middle of the city, complete with artificial lakes, pastures, and forests. The entrance hall featured a colossal 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself, gazing down upon the visitors like a god watching over his domain. The dining rooms had ceilings of ivory that could rotate to mimic the motion of the heavens and sprinkle perfume and flower petals upon the guests below. "Now I can finally live like a human being," he reportedly said, a statement that showed his complete detachment from the reality of his homeless subjects. The cost of this vanity project was astronomical, draining the treasury and forcing the devaluation of the Roman currency for the first time in history. To pay for it, he looted the temples of Greece and Asia Minor, stealing statues of gods to decorate his own private sanctuary of indulgence. The people of Rome made bitter jokes, saying that Rome had become a single house and that they would have to migrate to Veii to find space to live. The Domus Aurea was a marvel of engineering and art, but it stood as a monument to selfishness, a golden scar on the face of a suffering city. Every brick laid in that palace was another brick removed from the foundation of his support, alienating the very people he needed to survive. Discontent rippled through the aristocracy, coalescing into the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD, a plot involving senators, soldiers, and even Nero's friends. They planned to assassinate Nero during the games, a poetic end for a man who lived his life as if it were a theatrical performance. But the plot was betrayed by a freedman, leading to a swift and brutal purge that saw the execution of some of Rome's most brilliant minds. Seneca, the emperor's old tutor, was ordered to commit suicide, cutting his veins in a bath while dictating his final philosophical thoughts to his scribes. The poet Lucan, Nero's former friend, also met his end, reciting his own verses about a wounded soldier as he bled to death. The purge created a climate of absolute fear, where no one felt safe, and the emperor retreated further into his circle of sycophants and guards. He kicked Poppaea while she was pregnant during an argument, killing the only person he supposedly loved, an act that plunged him into deep depression. To replace her, he found a boy named Sporus who resembled her, castrated him, and married him in a bizarre ceremony that mocked the sanctity of marriage. The madness was now palpable. The emperor was no longer ruling Rome. He was merely surviving in a fantasy world of his own creation. But while he purged the enemies within the city walls, he failed to see the much larger threat gathering on the frontiers of the empire. In 68 AD, the facade finally cracked when Gaius Julius Vindex, a governor in Gaul, rose in open rebellion against the tyranny of the artist emperor. Vindex declared that Nero was not a legitimate ruler but a monster, calling on Galba, the governor of Spain, to take the throne and save Rome. Initially, Nero treated the news with disdain, reportedly joking that he would go to Gaul and weep and sing until the rebels surrendered to his art. But when the Praetorian Guard, his own personal protectors, were bribed to betray him, the reality of his situation crashed down with terrifying weight. The Senate declared him a public enemy, stripping him of his titles and sentencing him to be beaten to death in the ancient custom. Nero awoke in the palace to find it empty. His guards had fled, his friends had vanished, and even the servants had stolen the bed linens and left. He begged a gladiator to kill him, but no one would help. He cried out, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" realizing he was utterly alone. He fled the city in disguise, riding a horse towards a freedman's villa, covering his face with a handkerchief to avoid recognition by the soldiers hunting him. The most powerful man in the world was now a fugitive, shivering in a damp basement, waiting for the sound of approaching hooves that would signal his end. The empire he had inherited was crumbling, not from external invasion, but from the rot he had allowed to fester within his own heart. As the sound of horses approached the villa, Nero knew that the time for running was over, and the final scene of his life had to be played. He paced the room, weeping and muttering the famous phrase, "Qualis artifex perio," "What an artist dies in me," mourning his talent more than his life. He lacked the strength to drive the dagger into his own throat, forcing his secretary Epaphroditus to guide his trembling hand for the fatal blow. As the centurion entered the room to arrest him, he found the emperor bleeding to death, gasping his final words, "Too late, this is fidelity." Nero died on June 9, 68 AD, at the age of 30, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had founded the Roman Empire in a pool of his own blood. With his death, the line of Augustus was extinguished, and Rome was plunged into the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, a civil war of succession. The people initially celebrated, running through the streets wearing liberty caps, but soon they would miss the lavish games and bread he had provided. Nero was a monster, yes, but he was also a victim of a system that gave absolute power to damaged men and expected them to remain sane. His ghost would haunt Rome for centuries, a warning that art without morality and power without wisdom leads only to fire and ruin. I close the book. The scent of smoke fades from my mind, leaving behind one brutal truth I have learned across timelines. History is never written by the innocent. It is written by those who survive. If you believe history is more than just dates and battles, but a story of human souls, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to join our journey through time. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into Nero's madness, and share this video with a friend who loves uncovering the mysteries of the past. What do you think? Was Nero a monster born or a monster made? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let's discuss the truth together.